And welcome back. My name is Jessica Leichtweisz. I'm the CEO of Hope Education Services, and every week I assemble a panel of autistic adults who can help you understand autism at a much deeper level than I ever could. So we have parents send questions in, and then every week these people generously come, donate their time to get your questions answered. So a parent sent in a fantastic question, and that's, do I need to tell my child that they are autistic or they have autism, depending upon the phrasing you like to use? And when should I do that? And how do I know if they're ready? How do I know if it's a good idea? That's a really great question. To be honest, it's one I never thought of working with kids with autism. So I'm going to have our panelists come on and answer that question as to whether or not their parents ever had that conversation with them. If they did, when they did it, why they did it, if they think it was a good idea, and if they didn't, if they wish their parents would have. So you're going to hear directly from the most important people to answer that question. So Jeff is going to come on first. Jeff, did your parents ever at any point sit down and say, Jeff, we want to let you know, you're a little different from other kids. This is why. Did your parents ever have that conversation with you?
Well, actually, no. There's a really fascinating story behind me first learning I had autism. The story goes, when I was 9 years old, Nick News came to my house. They were doing a segment on autism, and they videoed me they interviewed me and videoed me for their segment. And that was the day that I first learned that I was diagnosed with autism. And ever since then, I've come to accept my identity as someone on the autism spectrum. And there are plenty of ways that you can tell your child that they're on the autism spectrum. There's a really great story. One of the self-advocates who I'm going to keep anonymous, told her story that her parents said that she was like Harry Potter. She was gifted, and she would go on to do great things. And the doctors look at autism as like this. Some look at like autism as like this. They'll never be successful. They'll never have a job. They'll never make any friends. And again, that's where we have to come in and say, let us prove you wrong. So if there are plenty of ways to tell a child that they have autism, you just got to find the right time and the right place to do it.
Yeah, Jeff. And honestly, you and everyone, all the panelists on here, you guys are all people who've proved people wrong. And to be honest, I was one of those professionals when I first started who thought, when I was working with kids that were nonverbal at a young age, and the next person we're going to hear from, Michelle, she didn't start talking until she was 6. I was one of those people who just kind of thought, well, you know what? These kids aren't going to have any chance. And even though I was working with them and teaching them, I believed that for a really long time. And you proved that wrong. Everyone, all of the panelists, you guys prove that wrong every single day. And that's why I want to share your stories, because really well-intended people like myself may not really fully understand that autism is a difference in the way a person experiences the world, but it doesn't need to limit how they experience the world or how they show up in the world. And that's really beautiful. So Michelle, your story of how you found out you were autistic, when did you find out you were autistic? Did your parents tell you? Do you wish they did? And is there any reason that a parent should tell a child that they are on the spectrum?
So for me, how that happened was that I first learned about living with autism was when I was in 6th grade. And it was actually one day I was at a family friend's house. We were going to hang out and stuff, and they literally just moved in not too long into their townhouse and everything. And so we were just going to hang out with them one day, and we were watching a documentary about Dr. Temple Grandin. So after watching that documentary and stuff, my parents were kind of discussing in the way, not to like the full extent, but they were just saying about how like they were telling me about how there are some things about what Dr. Temple Grandin that reminds of me, like the way that she thinks, and like how like everyone has a different way of thinking and stuff. And so pretty much from that, that's where like my parents kind of described that about that I was living with autism, and that made me, for me in a way, it actually, for me it turned out more positive because actually I felt like I was learning more about myself, in a way, because there were things about myself that like, it made me feel like uh, different in a good way and everything, because it just, there are things that I know that I think differently and it's okay, so I want to let parents know that like you just like what Jeff was saying like how it you have to know your child like at the point where you're like you would see like where you feel that you're gonna know when you feel it's right to like share about it.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Michelle. And I've actually had other people I've interviewed before who were adults and they wound up seeking a diagnosis as an adult. And they said that it made them feel validated. Like they always felt like they didn't fit in, they always felt different, and they didn't understand why. And it caused anxiety and depression. And then when they got the label was very freeing because it helped them understand themselves. And they realized that there was nothing wrong with them. This is just who they were. And so it helped them a lot. And so for me, I based upon that, I would think as a child, it could potentially have that same impact. And so it's validating to hear you say like, yeah, it was positive. It made me understand myself. And that's a really great way, I think, of articulating it. So thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Jesse, so did your parents ever sit down and say, and I know you had a diagnosis of Asperger's, obviously, when they were calling it Asperger's. Did your parents ever sit down and say, Jesse, this is what your diagnosis is and this is what it means? Did you want that conversation? Do you think parents should have that conversation?
In the 1990s, when I was diagnosed around 14, I was 14 years old in 1996. It was still a pretty obscure diagnosis. I knew what autism was, but I always thought it was the more severe kind. That's how we thought of autism back then. And I remember in middle school, I was told by my mother and father that I was born with some kind of a disorder, and they had no name for it. They just knew that there was something. I was tested by a neurologist at the age of 6, and this neurologist, who actually died pretty recently at a very old age of his 90-somethings, said that my biggest hurdle in life would be socially. His name's Dr. Arnold Gold. You can look him up. He's famous for diagnosing a lot of children for many years. But anyway, that did not really give us many answers. And it was in middle school, I knew I had something, but it was when I was in my freshman year of high school at age 14, when my family took me to a psychiatrist after having a disastrous transition into high school. And also, even before that, in 8th grade, I was exhibiting OCD behaviors according to my family. I was writing extremely long answers for science homework, and that was just because the only self-esteem I got during those days was 100 in a class. And according to them, I was also washing my hands obsessively to the point where they were red and cracked. But to be honest, I just think it was the weather back then. A simple therapeutic cream could have solved that problem many times over, but they just thought it was due to OCD, and that's what led to multiple visits to a psychiatrist, and he was the one who diagnosed me finally. And still, I had never heard of Asperger's syndrome, and that's when we started to kind of unwrap the mystery and enigma of why it was so different.
Yeah, and so do you think that you felt like it was a relief when you found out? Do you think parents do you encourage parents to tell children, this is what your diagnosis is and this is what it means and this is why things are hard for you?
I believe that it depends on the situation and the child. I'm a firm believer in the expression, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it. There could be children out there who are just having a wonderful experience. Everyone likes them. They're earning good grades. Everything is what we call hunky-dory. And there have been a few moments of my life that were like that for a very prolonged period of time. So in that case, you can tell the child that they're unique, but you don't have to go into detail about the diagnosis, especially if it's going to create a lot more problems that it's going to solve. But if a child is being relentlessly bullied in school and being called a freak, a loser, and told to transform into somebody they'll never be, then it is a good idea to let the child know you're not a loser, you're a wonderful person and no one understands yet, but they will most likely someday, and talk about their condition. But when you explain the quagmire of Asperger's or high-functioning autism, you want to emphasize that it's just a means of working much harder to compensate for weaknesses. You don't want the child thinking, well, now I have an excuse as to why I cannot help it, and this is going to be my golden ticket to get out of trouble. And a lot of times in adulthood, when a child does not learn to compensate, then they'll find out that having Asperger's is not going to protect them from consequences for genuinely inappropriate actions.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jesse. Thank you for sharing that. And you're right. It's important that parents pick the time when they know that your child's ready. And I feel like parents, like you kind of know when your child's ready to hear that. And it's important for many kids to understand that, but also understand, like you said, it's not an excuse. You don't want to use it as a like, well, things are hard because you're autistic and that's just how it's going to be. Because you do run the risk of, right, Jesse, of just creating it as a limitation for your child, where you don't want to make your child believe they have certain limitations that they may not have.
Right. My favorite expression is, you're an adult first and somebody with a disability second.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. And Kevin, so I want to hear your perspective of this. So you already have our question. Did anyone ever sit down and say, Kevin, you're autistic, this is what that means, and do you wish they did?
Well, right. So here's, kind of my history there is, I, had a lot of problems like in school, and would struggle like really behaviorally in school compared to most of my peers. And one day I finally went to my mom and said, do I have any certain condition that really is causing me to have these to struggle with behaviorally so much in school compared to my peers? And my mom did, yes, honestly tell me I have this condition called Asperger syndrome. And I was diagnosed with that at the age of 7, and it was at the age of 11 that I was having this conversation with my mom, and she never told me that. No, they never really had this conversation with me before then, and it took me really asking about it for either of my parents to have this conversation with me. And I would say, really, I think as far as whether or not it was a good idea or a bad idea to have it with me, then sooner or later, it's mixed. There were mixed results there. It was like part of me was relieved to hear I had something that could explain why things were so much harder for me, but at the same time, another part of me was really not liking having this label. And Jesse, when you talk about using it as an excuse to, I'm afraid I was guilty of doing that to a little bit. So my because it wasn't long after that when I started to think, okay, so when I'm doing all these inappropriate things in school, I have an excuse for it, but really, nah, you can't really do. But I would say I quickly learned through. It didn't take me long through the years to learn that no, that's not really the way things work, and but then after that I became like someone who did heavy masking, really, like, okay, so I want to be as less aspy as possible. Yeah, I want to be as little as less, really want to be as least autistic as I can possibly be, and I think I still to an extent try to be that way a little bit, in spite of discovering, like the strengths that really do, the unique strengths and abilities that do come with having, Asperger's autism. And I also want to kind of go off on really acknowledge, like, I heard of Asperger's before I heard of autism, when I was first explained to my condition, like interestingly enough, I didn't hear of the term autism and autistic until 2 years after that, and the way I actually first heard of the term autistic was from an old commercial back in the 90s that you Jesse and you Jeff might remember, from Doug Flutie, who did that cereal commercial where he talked about being the father of an autistic child, and that was how I first heard of autism, and then when I first heard that term autistic, my first reaction was and heard that it was like Asperger's was somewhat kind of comparable, similar to that. My first reaction was like, really? Shoot, I didn't like hearing that, because because once I was learning about what being autistic meant, it really meant someone who was significantly disabled and, didn't talk, so I didn't really like being associated with being an autistic. And but really over time, once I've discovered some of the unique strengths and abilities that come with being an autistic, and how really being an autistic doesn't necessarily mean that you're nonverbal, and that you're you have are very low functioning. I began to actually at times even proudly say I'm an autistic who I say everything I do, that really a lot of, like, I graduated college top of my class, I drive a car, I've held down a job successfully for all these years, and I'm autistic, that I'm I'm happy to say that. But at the same time, while I say that proudly, I also at the same time feel like there is a factor there of carrying this label and letting it, limit me, in certain areas, consciously or subconsciously. There is a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that comes with having that label. So I would really say to parents, be careful. Yeah, be careful with when you disclose to your child that, about the label he has and what the label means. And I would say be especially careful about disclosing the limitations that may come with having the label, because those limitations can, saying you're going to struggle in this area because you have this label, that you could make that become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the caution, right, Kevin, is just making sure that if you tell a child, listen, you're autistic, that it's always to help them understand who they are, but it's always meant to be moving forward rather than limiting. Because you don't want to say, well, you're limited by this, but this could help you understand why this is hard. It's a very personal choice. And I think everyone brings up really great points as to why you should tell a child and when you should tell a child, and really both that good and not so good things could come from it. So just being really prepared for that as a parent. And I do think it's a good idea from a professional background that if you're going to do this, you do have professionals to support you through the process. And even as a parent, that you're getting support, because as a parent, you may need support on how to coach your child through this as well, and just even emotionally to deal with that. So thank you guys so much for sharing your story. I know it's so helpful to parents who come on here every week. If you want to come and ask your questions, we typically do these webinars every week live at 8 p.m. on Tuesday nights. You just head over to my website, hopeeducationservices.com. That's how you can register and be here live. Tonight, we're actually, because of the election, we're recording this after the fact. We're just recording a video anyway, but parents did send in their questions. If you have any questions, you can't make it live, but you want to send in, you can reach me on my website as well. So I really hope that this helped you. I hope it helped you answer your questions. I do want to just share with you, last final thing, we do have a book called This is Autism out. Everyone who answered the questions today is part of it. In this book, 12 autistic adults share their story of what it's like to live with autism, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what they think you should know as a parent to do a really good job being an autism mom or autism dad. So check that book out. This is Autism. It's available on Amazon. And we look forward to hopefully connecting one time on one of these webinars or seeing you in another video. Thanks, guys. Take care.